This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm Mac Pritchard, your host and publisher of Mac's List. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Ben Forstag, Becky Thomas, and Jessica Black from the Mac's List team. This week, we're talking about how to get and give LinkedIn recommendations. Recommendations are a vital part of your LinkedIn profile. Readers will more likely trust what you say about your skills and your accomplishments if you include testimonials from others. Our guest expert this week is author Viveka von Rosen. Later in the show, Viveka explains why LinkedIn recommendations are so powerful and how to make the most of them. Before you buy a product or service, you probably check online reviews. What people say about a company plays a big part in our purchasing decisions these days, and the same principle applies in a job search. Ben has found a blog post that shows how to use online recommendations and other social proof to get job interviews. He tells us more in a moment. Many jobs may require experience you don't have. How do you get that experience without having done the job? That's our question of the week. It comes from a listener in Portland, Daniel, and Becky shares her advice shortly. First, as always, let's check in with the Mac's List team, and we turn to you, Ben, because you're out there every week searching the nooks and crannies of the internet, looking for websites, books, and tools our listeners can use in a job search and their careers. So what have you found for our listeners this week?
So this week in preparing for the show, I spent a lot of time thinking about why recommendations really are so important in a job search. Because on one level, they seem like such pro forma things, something that everyone can find someone who will say something nice about you. So how enlightening can a recommendation really be, right? But at the same time, there's an undeniable power to social proof. So I decided to dig into this a little deeper. I was kind of looking for some article that would say here's the science behind social proof or recommendations and why they work. But what I came across instead was an interesting anecdote, and this comes from the website ninjasandrobots.com, which...
Great title.
Yeah, best website ever. And it's the title of the article is called Using the Science of Influence to Look for a New Job. And it's by this guy named Nathan Contney, who's a computer engineer and an entrepreneur. He's one of these tech guys who has started a half a dozen different companies and shows up on TED Talks and stuff like that. But anyway, this is an older post. It's from 2012, where Nathan talks about his wife's successful job hunt and how she used social proof to get interviews. So it's a really simple thing. She gathered up all the recommendations people had written about her on LinkedIn, as well as some really positive reviews she had received from employers and clients. And these were very specific comments. It wasn't just oh, she's a nice lady. It was she did a great job with this project, or she got the budget in on time, things like that. Very task-oriented recommendations. And she just listed all of these recommendations on a piece of paper and attached it with her application materials. It was just another piece of paper. Now, I got to admit, this sounds a little bit brash to me, but it evidently really worked. And that's because social proof is this really powerful influencer of behavior. And it's not even a conscious influencer a lot of times.
And it's striking as you speak, Ben, the thought that went through my mind when you're talking about what she did is what experts recommend people do with a resume, which is don't talk about your roles and responsibilities, talk about your accomplishments, the results you produced. And she didn't collect, it sounds testimonies that said she was a wonderful person, but this is what she did for me.
Exactly. It wasn't the glowing character references. I think those are important too, but it was really very tactical. And I think the thing to remember here is how kind of subconscious this is, the influence of this kind of social proof. Because again, I would when I hear about this, I think, but everyone could do that. But the bottom line is everyone doesn't do it. And the truth is, all these social science studies have shown that if the four of us went downstairs and all pointed up in the sky like we were looking at something, we could probably get like other people convinced that they saw something up in the sky as well, right? Social proof has this very strong influencing factor on people. And sometimes it's just like listing, here's what other people think, that has a really strong influence on the hiring manager. And this is the same reason why whenever you go to any website to buy something, there's always recommendations from past clients or other folks who've bought the product, stunning reviews on the covers of books. These things really work. So, in addition to talking about this social proof influencer, Cotney, the writer, also talks about some other subtle ways to persuade employers, including things like reciprocity and anchoring. And let me just discuss those very quickly here. Reciprocity is one we talk about a lot on the show without ever really using that word. But basically, it's just giving the employer something of value, a suggestion of how they could improve the product, or an article you thought they might like, or a review of the podcast, anything like that. And the idea here is that if you give one human being something, they're much more obliged or to feel like they're obliged to give you something in return. And in this case, it'd be like their time to show you that you're the right candidate. He also talks about anchoring, which is an interesting one. I think, I'm not sure we've ever actually talked about this strategy. This is more of a job salary negotiating tool where, if you establish a baseline number, you can reframe the entire conversation around this. And actually, he mentioned a really interesting study. This is completely off topic. But if you take a group of people and ask them two questions, the first question is, what is your social security number, or the last four digits of your social security number? And then how much do you think that car is worth over there? When people say their social security number, if the last four digits are higher, they almost always evaluate a higher price to the vehicle. And if it's lower, they evaluate a lower price. And that's because in their mind, they're anchoring a higher number early on, and that influences all subsequent conversations. So his point was you could anchor a salary negotiation around oh, I know this guy over here is making $100,000, but I only want 90. And that could make the employer who was only planning on paying 80 pay you a little bit more. So this was really interesting. It was a long form article. It's definitely worth going into and reading on your own.
It was really interesting. I really appreciated a lot of his perspectives on it in terms of, talking about everybody looking at the sky and why the psychology of that is so compelling. But then her tactics of using that to put that into the job interview form of, instead of using references available on request, which is a pretty typical standard that we use.
And means almost nothing.
Yeah, and everybody writes that, and like you were saying, Ben, everyone has references, and everyone can find someone that can say something nice about them. But going into a job interview with an additional piece of paper attached to your resume with a couple of sort of testimonials about your quality and your value is I'd be interested to see that in person. I've never actually experienced that, and so it obviously worked for her, but I would love to hear from someone that I know that has done it as well, because I think that's also a little bit bold of a choice, but I think it can also really work.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I read a lot of articles written by people who are career experts, that's what they do for a living. And Nathan, who wrote this article, is not a career guy. He's a computer engineer, and looking at the challenge of a job search from kind of a data and psychological perspective, I think is really interesting. And I would encourage you to check it out. Again, it's on the website ninjasandrobots.com. And the article's name is Using the Science of Influence to Look for a New Job. And we will have the link in the show notes.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben. And if you've got a suggestion for Ben, please write him. We would love to hear from you and use your ID on the show. Ben's address is ben@maxlist.org. Now let's turn to you, our listeners, and Becky's here to answer one of your questions. Becky, what's in the Max List mailbag this week?
Let me open up the old
It's becoming
mailbag.
a tongue twister.
Yeah. So this week we have a question that we recorded from our recent event that we had here in Portland, a networking event. So let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and my question is, pretty much every job I look at, in the requirements, they want you to pretty much already done the job. I'm just wondering, how you gain enough experience that you don't have to have already kind of done every job you apply for?
So this is a good question. I think a lot of people feel this sort of, I'm not qualified enough to get the job, so how am I supposed to get the experience to get the job in the first place?
The
kind of
catch-22.
conundrum. It's
Yeah.
such a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of people have this, especially if you're like new to the job world, if you're like a recent grad or something like that, or if you're changing careers and you're like, how do I get experience? So I think the first thing to keep in mind, and I think especially if you've been applying for jobs for a long time, it's like really frustrating to read all those requirements and be like, how is that even possible? Just know that job descriptions are like a wish list. Most employers don't expect you to fulfill like all of those requirements. So if you can get like over halfway there, you probably can fill in the rest with some other things. So just, keep that in mind as a baseline that, employers are sort of like, oh yeah, I'd love to have this, I'd love to have that, that would be great. But they're going to be willing to compromise on some of these things. And then the second thing to think about is to really be able to know and understand your own skills. You need to be able to really talk about your core value as a professional, what you bring to the table in any job, and have examples to back that up. So that's something that you need to do on your own sort of end before you're going into interviews and applying for jobs. You need to really get that sort of understanding of yourself as a professional and, being able to talk about it in a clear way. But as far as tactics go, like I said, if you're new to the job market or switching fields, there are some things that you can do to get more experience. So the first thing is I feel like I talk about this a lot, but you need to be able to position your transferable skills for the role that you want. Mm-hmm. So like, for example, if you're like a recent college grad, look at the summer jobs that you've had, the work study jobs that you've had in college, and any extracurricular experience. And, that can be transferred into like a base skill that you can use for a lot of other jobs. And then for like a career change, if you're changing fields, just really get down and sort of nail down the value in your previous experience and relate that value to the job at hand. And then the other thing that I've had success in, and I know a lot of other folks have too, is to volunteer to gain relevant experience, whether you're like doing sort of a weekend volunteer project with a nonprofit, you could do an unpaid internship. Another thing to think about if you're currently working and don't have a lot of free time, a lot of professional organizations will work with like a nonprofit or a community organization and match like professionals in the field with those nonprofits that need services. And that gives you like a time-limited project, but it also gives you like a clear deliverable. If you're putting together some sort of plan for a nonprofit and you're working with other professionals, that's a great way to network too. So those are some resources. So just keep in mind, do what you can and know yourself and really sort of get creative as far as your own experience. And yeah, that's sort of the advice I have. And as I was sort of making this list of advice for Daniel, I remembered that we have a blog on the Max List blog with a lot of the same resources. So I will link to that in the show notes.
Nice.
Great advice.
Any other thoughts, guys?
I was going to just say, so I'm going to reiterate using the I wasn't going to use the term transferable skills, but I like that a lot. And I was going to say more of the demonstrating how you're capable of doing the job, even though with the previous experience that you've had. So whatever you've done in your past, positions, demonstrating how that sets you apart from other people and how it will transfer into this current job and how you're capable and qualified and bring value to the table there. So I think I like your point about getting a little bit creative with that, because I think that's not always a one-to-one transfer or substitute or however it shakes out that way. But using what you've done in the past to show that because I think that you don't necessarily have to have done the exact job to still be qualified for this new job. And so making sure that you can just weave the story together to demonstrate that what you've done in the past is relevant and can set you apart. And, maybe even set you above some other candidates who haven't done the things that you've done. How can your previous experiences bring you into that new role?
just to build off the idea that job descriptions are wish lists, I think you also have to keep in mind, like, you still are at a disadvantage if you don't check off enough of those boxes compared to candidates who do that. Yeah. And that's why I think like networking becomes really important, because the more someone knows you as a person, as a professional in general, the easier it is to like kind of talk around or get over that challenge of not being able to check off all the boxes in terms of qualifications. I mean, I think employers forget this, but I think they also know this is true. Like, you can teach people a lot of different skills, and even if someone knows how to web design one way, like an employer may well want to reteach you how to web design their way. And so like coming into the job with experience is important, but not like a be all end all. And so again, I think if you network, if you get yourself out there in general, when these opportunities come around, you're going to have a much stronger hand applying for them, even if you aren't the quote perfect candidate in terms of qualifications.
Yeah.
Well, great. And I would only add, Becky, I know we've used this ratio before on the show or mentioned it, and you touched on it at the start, which is that most employers are looking to get 60 to 70%. Mm-hmm. And so many applicants forget that. And there's also research out there that shows men who don't have 100% of qualifications are likely to apply for a job if they've got 50, 60, 70%, and women aren't. So recognize that, as you said, it's employers don't expect to get everything. And think about how you can fill in those gaps.
Yep. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you, Daniel. And if you've got a question for Becky, please send her an email. Her address is becky@maxlist.org. You can also call our listener line. That number is area code 716-JOB-TALK. Or send us a tweet and just find MaxList on Twitter. Our handle is @MaxList. If we use your question on the show, we'll send you a copy of Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. We'll be back in just a moment. And when we return, I'll talk with this week's guest expert, Viveka von Rosen, about how to get and give LinkedIn recommendations. Now let's turn to this week's guest expert, Viveka von Rosen. Viveka von Rosen is co-founder of Vengresso. It's the world's largest full-spectrum social selling provider, and she's also the author of 2 best-selling books, LinkedIn Marketing, An Hour a Day, and LinkedIn, 100 Ways to Rock Your Personal Brand. She joins us today from Loveland, Colorado. Viveka, thanks for being on the show.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to have you. And our topic this week, of course, is LinkedIn, and we're focusing in on recommendations. Yeah. So, recommendations are a form of social proof. And let's step back and talk about social proof. What is it, and why does it matter in a job search or in our careers?
Well, I think now more than any other time, people can pretty much say anything they want about themselves online. So I can get on LinkedIn and call myself a LinkedIn expert. I could get, LinkedIn expert of Colorado.com. There are a lot of ways that I can buy, beg, or borrow expertise in my industry without really earning it. And I think the validity of a good recommendation is that it is truly, it is true credibility. It is other people saying that you've actually achieved this level of knowledge or expertise or positioning or whatever it is that you're trying to establish. And so I just think it brings a lot more validity to the claim of, your skill set, your area of expertise.
Well, let's talk about LinkedIn recommendations. And these are those testimonials that appear next to our job descriptions on our LinkedIn profiles. And they're different from I think it's called skills and experiences. Those are the particular
endorsements. Yes, exactly. So you have skills, and then people can endorse you for those skills. And it's really no more than like a Facebook like, Whereas the recommendation is a longer form testimonial that someone actually takes the time and makes an effort to write out. Like we would see on a website, or in a recommendation letter, where someone's actually taken the time to talk about you and why you're so good at what you do.
So, what kind of difference can a LinkedIn recommendation make to your page and to your job search?
Well, I think it can make a substantial difference for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it's kind of a lost art. It's people are lazy, and so they don't think to ask and or give recommendations. So if you have them, it can really differentiate you from, say, the other person who's looking for the exact same job that you're looking for, but you've got all of these recommendations from previous, employers, from your professors at your school, from colleagues, from happy clients. Now, I'm saying this with a caveat. There are some industries, financial, legal, and medical, where there are constraints to what you're allowed to share. So just be aware of that. If you're in the financial industry, if you're in medical, or if you're in legal industry, please be aware of some of the different constraints and conditions that you might have, compliance issues that you might have. But in most cases, if you've got a previous employer and a previous client and a colleague saying you're awesome and why you're awesome, and giving it some examples of why you're awesome, it's really going to differentiate you from somebody who doesn't have anything on their profile, or it says he's nice or she's nice. Now, I say it's a lost art because LinkedIn has made it a lot more difficult to give and get recommendations, especially if you're new to LinkedIn. You used to be able to just go to linkedin.com/recs/ask, or you used to be able to scroll down to the bottom of your profile and very easily see where the recommendations were and ask for them. But on people who are newer to LinkedIn, you might not see that option, and you might not know where to go to get these recommendations. So again, glad you're listening. If you go to a person's profile who you want the recommendation from, first of all, you have to make sure that your first level connections, meaning that you have invited them to connect at some point and they've accepted, or they've invited you and you've accepted, but you have to be first level connections. And then basically to the right of their picture, you'll see 3 little dots, whether you're on mobile or on desktop. And from those 3 dots, you have the option of either requesting a recommendation or even recommending that person. Which is something else we'll talk about in just a moment. So that is where you go in and ask for the recommendation. And I think the reason you don't see as many recommendations on LinkedIn is because people just can't find that one little link, because it's not very obvious anymore.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all that and the clarity of those instructions, because I don't think I'm alone in this. Sometimes LinkedIn is just not intuitive, and it can be difficult to navigate.
No, it definitely, it's as with all social media sites, they try to simplify the user interface and make it more attractive. And they've tried to align the desktop user interface a little bit more with the mobile version of it. But in doing so, they've gotten rid of a lot of features or the ability to easily find features. Like there used to be a drop down where in profile where you could ask or give recommendations. Well, the only way now is those 3 little dots, or if you already have recommendations or have given recommendations, you can also go to that section. But the 3 little dots is to the right of the person's name on their profile is the easiest way to find that section.
So we know where to go and the difference that good recommendations can make to a LinkedIn page. How many recommendations do you suggest people collect? How many, say, per position?
I'd say, per position, 2 or 3. It spaces them out pretty nicely. Now, if you're newer to the job market, or you've, switched your industries completely, you might want to make it a little bit more top heavy. You might want to get 3 to 5 in your first or second or third experience listed. And for job seekers who are looking for a job, but also maybe they're doing some contract or some consulting work, you can definitely add that as an experience, add that into your experience section. And then most definitely I would recommend getting some recommendations for that as well, as long as it's aligned with the job that you're actually looking for. If you're doing consulting and architecture and you're looking for a legal position, that might be a little bit askew. But as long as, if you are a consultant and you're looking for a position, you've got those recommendations in your recent, current, and past experience. It looks better. It's easier to find. Those recommendations are easier to find and read. And by the way, it makes your profile more searchable. So we can talk about best practices in just a moment. But having those keywords, those search terms actually in the recommendations themselves makes your profile more findable when, say, someone in HR, a hiring manager, or a business owner is looking for a candidate or an employee.
Well, let's talk about the strategy of recommendations, who we should ask, and what we should ask them to say. Who's at the top of the list here? If we're aiming to get 2 or 3 per position, who are the best people to ask for those recommendations?
Well, certainly past employers. I mean, provided you left on a good note.
Right.
If not, you might skip them. That kind of goes without saying. Similarly, if you're new to the job market, maybe you just graduated, if you can get a professor to write a recommendation for you. If you're in marketing, that probably won't be a problem. Your professors are probably telling you to get on LinkedIn right now. It might be a little bit more difficult in situations where your professors just plain and simple don't use LinkedIn or are unwilling to connect with you on LinkedIn. Like I mentioned before, happy clients, again, not unhappy clients, but if you can get a recommendation from a happy client, that always looks good. Colleagues, of course, that looks good. Influencers in your industry, if you happen to know and somewhat regularly engage with an influencer in your industry. I sometimes get people I have no idea who they are asking me for a recommendation, and not only am I not going to give it, I'm probably going to disconnect from that person too. So make sure that you actually know the people that you're asking to get a recommendation from. You might need to remind them who you are. Well, again, we'll talk about best practices in just a second, but you might need to remind someone how they know you, because we these days have a whole bunch of people through social and through our engagement, have a whole bunch of people running through our lives. So it never hurts to remind people. Getting one from your massage therapist is probably not going to be overly helpful. Getting one from, he's nice, she's nice isn't extremely useful. The more comprehensive the recommendation is, the better it looks, the better it reads, and the more likely it is to help your profile get found in a search as well.
And I'm guessing family members are probably not the most effective.
Uncles, nieces,
Right.
Exactly.
So
she cleaned her room regularly as a child.
Well, there's some merit in that. But again, you've only got a couple of recommendations, ideally per position, so you want to make the most of those limited opportunities.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that's the who. Now, let's talk about the what and the how. You've identified, a list of people for past positions or time at university or college that you're going to approach. What's the best way to make the ask? And
Sure.
What's the strategy behind that? What do you want them to say, and how do you go about doing it?
Sure, absolutely. So first thing is making sure that your first level connection. And, sometimes asking or giving a recommendation is a great opportunity to connect. And like I said, there are some cases where, especially with some professors, and I have no idea why this is, but they're like, I don't connect with my students. So, okay. But in many cases, when you reach out to connect with someone, or ask them for a recommendation, you'll see that they're not a first level connection. And so you can just click on the connect button. Now, if you're on mobile, similarly to what we were talking about before, if you just hit connect, it's just going to send the invitation. You're not going to get to personalize it. On the desktop, you can always personalize it just by clicking on connect. So if you are more mobile savvy, the same place, those 3 little dots, it'll say personalize invitation. So in both cases, personalize the invitation by saying something like, hey, person that I used to work with. I am building out my LinkedIn profile. I listen to this podcast. I'm realizing I kind of dropped the ball as far as recommendations. We had a great working relationship together. So I was hoping you'd be willing to connect so I could ask you for a recommendation. Or similarly, we worked together and I'd love to give you a recommendation, but in order to do so, we need to connect first. So using the recommendation as a reason to connect. Now, if you're already connected, when you go to the three little dots beside their name and ask for the recommendation, don't go with just the default, because LinkedIn's going to put some default languaging in there. Again, remind them how you know each other. Remind them of the work you did. You could even give them some bullet points as far as, what to speak about. Can you speak about my timeliness, my knowledge, how well I worked with clients, my ability to code, whatever it is that you do. You could even give them some talking points. It makes it much easier for them to write the recommendation for you. And you're going to get a better recommendation. Now, in some cases, people know you, love you, they're going to write a great recommendation no matter what. So you could just, say, hey, I need a recommendation on LinkedIn. You know what to say, go for it. But in most, I would even say many cases, or in many, I would say most cases, give them some talking points, give them some bullets to mention, and obviously change them up. You don't want the exact same bullets showing up on every single recommendation. Yeah. It's going to look a little obvious. So you could change that up a little bit. And then there are people who've probably already written you a recommendation or a testimonial, right? You might have a website with testimonials on it. Even if you're a job seeker, it's possible that, again, you do some consulting or some contract work, so you have your own website. You can always find those people on LinkedIn and say, you wrote this wonderful testimonial for me on my website 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 months ago. I'm trying to, get them all on LinkedIn too. Would you be willing to write it on LinkedIn? Here's what you originally wrote, copy paste. So that's definitely something to consider if someone has already written you a testimonial, either online or, for a previous job, etc. As long as it's still relevant to who and what you do now, who you are and what you do now. And then there are some people who are super busy. They won't be offended. Write the recommendation for them. Hey, Jane, we worked together for years, and I know how busy you are. We often talked about something. So I was hoping that you'd be willing to write me a recommendation based on our past conversations. I put something together for you. Please feel free to use it yourself. Please feel free to use it, or, always feel free to write something unique. Copy paste. You basically want to make it as easy as possible for people to write you that recommendation.
I'm glad you brought that up about making it easy for people to say yes, because I think often people use the default form in LinkedIn, send off the request, and are puzzled and sometimes hurt that they don't get a response. And so the thing you can control is you can either put together bullets or talking points, or even in some cases draft recommendations, and it makes it so much easier for the person at the other end to help you. The only other thing I would add is I love your suggestion about testimonials. Often we receive thank you notes from clients or colleagues or supervisors.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to say at that time, hey, would you mind adapting this for a LinkedIn recommendation? And when someone gives you a thank you like that, my experience has been they're more than happy to say it publicly as well. Well, great. So
yeah, exactly. I love that recommendation. Actually, that's a great recommendation for recommendations.
So we know who we should reach out to and what we might ask them to do. And but how, if you don't hear back after you've done all those things, sent off the bullets or the draft, what are your suggestions about following up? How should people follow up?
Yeah, follow up on a different medium. So it is entirely possible that the person you asked for a recommendation from has never once gone into their inbox and they just plain and simple didn't see it. So you might show up, you might follow up with them a week later or even just a couple days later and say, hey, probably via email, but certainly for those of you who still remember how to use a phone, you can always pick up the phone and say, hey, I sent you a request for a recommendation a couple days ago on LinkedIn. Noticed you hadn't had a chance to to look at it yet or to do it yet. Just wanted to make sure that you got it. B, make sure that you were aware of it, and C, just make sure that you're okay with it. Like, because some people might be, I saw that, and I'd love to send you a recommendation, but due to compliance issues, I'm not allowed to, or due to the fact that you work with a competitor, I'm not allowed to, or due to whatever. And so they might not, be willing to say that for some reason on LinkedIn, but on the phone or in an email, they might tell you the real reason. But generally, if someone does not write a recommendation for you, it's because they plain and simple did not see your request.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up as well, because I think many of us will check our email a number of times every day, but we might check our LinkedIn. There are LinkedIn nerds like you and I and my co-hosts, but most people might not check their LinkedIn account more than several times a month, so they might not see it.
And additionally, it's better now, but for a while it was super awkward to give and get recommendations because LinkedIn would just send you a link. It wouldn't take you anywhere. And so you just didn't know what to do. You're like, okay, now what am I supposed to do? So if you tried giving or asking for recommendations, say, 3-4 months to a year ago, and nothing happened with it, just be aware that LinkedIn was a little difficult for a while there. So, go try again. Go try again.
Well, how important is it to give recommendations ourselves? And how do you recommend people approach that?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of people give to get, and I don't know that that's necessarily the best overall strategy. Like, I'm going to give 500 recommendations so that I get 100 back. The problem with that is it's very time consuming. And people can see that, right? They can see the ratio of given to received. And of course, you always want your received to be more than your given. So, just be aware of the ratio. However, having said that, there are times when you might most definitely want to give a recommendation because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, it gives you an opportunity to connect with someone because you want to write them a recommendation. Of course, if there's someone and you're just so blown away by them or by their company, definitely give a recommendation. Because it shows you as being a genuine and an interested individual and not necessarily just a taker. It can help to align you with a person's brand. Maybe there's an influencer that you admire and you happen to be first level connections on LinkedIn and you've seen her speak or you've read his books. Please feel free to give them a recommendation too, because it stands out far above and beyond anything else you can really do for them on LinkedIn. Like, yes, you could send them a message, but they may or may not see it. Yes, you can, like their articles or share their content, but they may or may not get notified. But they are very likely to see if you write a recommendation for them. So it is a great way. But again, don't write a bunch of recommendations in the hopes of just getting in touch with that person. Like, there has to be genuine intent. And then having said all that, just keep the ratio more received than given.
Terrific. Well, tell us what's next for you.
Yeah, so lots and lots. We've got a new company, Vengresso, so lots happening with that. We're very much in the social selling, digital transformation sphere, which is, by the way, as a job seeker, not everyone needs to be involved in the whole digital transformation arena. But as far as making sure that you've got a strong brand online while you're looking for a job, and in some cases, some of you creating content in order to really elevate yourself as an expert. So the two ways, right, that you can really position yourself as an expert is have other people call you an expert, hence recommendations and endorsements. The other thing is showcase your expertise by sharing, valuable content that, like I said, showcases your expertise. So we've got with Vengresso, we've got a boot camp that we do about once a quarter that walks you through all the stages of being successful on LinkedIn, from creating a strong brand with your profile to finding the right people to engage with, employers, gateway people at companies that you want to work with, to creating really good content, and then pulling that all together to really amp up your engagement.
Well, I know people can find you at your website, which is vengresso.com. And then we'll be sure to include a link to your website as well as your books and information
Thank
about
you.
your boot camps in our show notes. Well, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right. Take care. Well, we're back in the Maxlist studio with Becky, Ben, and Jessica. What are some key points you all heard from my conversation with Viveka?
I thought her energy was great. Loved
love
just
that.
listening to her tips.
Really
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. And I like that she did give us some step-by-step, because it can be hard to like find how to ask for recommendations specifically. But I liked her point about sort of quality over quantity. Like, you want to reach out to people who are going to give you a valuable, sort of more substantive recommendation than just like, oh, that person's nice, but like someone who has worked with you and can give like a very sort of detailed recommendation.
Concrete facts, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the most valuable.
Yeah, she didn't say this explicitly, but sometimes I think people were tempted to reach out to people who are VIPs in our field, but may not know us. And I think the better.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't either. And because I think the people, to your point, who know our work best are going to be able to speak to it best.
Yeah, and that sweet spot is definitely somebody who is more respected in the field and has worked with you directly. But
Right.
sometimes you don't always have that at that stage in your career, so you got to work with what you have. But yeah, I thought it was
Yeah,
good.
and I think it doesn't take anything away. You
Yeah.
know, it actually, like, to both of your points, I think it is quality over quantity.
Yeah.
In terms of having somebody that does directly know you will rather than a person that's highly respected in your field that can give you a very mediocre or not very great at all recommendation.
Yeah,
I think that
superficial recommendation.
actually will hurt you more than a stellar recommendation from an quote unquote unknown person, but that who knows you really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I also liked her focus on giving recommendations as well. I think that that's something that when people think about getting recommendations, they don't always think about that reciprocity that we talked about before. And I think that that is equally important. But I liked her note about making sure that it's authentic. And same thing, you know, you want to make sure that you are giving a recommendation of somebody that you really know and are willing to vouch for, because, you know, you are kind of sticking your neck out for someone. And so you don't want to just give anyone oh yeah, they did great, or kind of fudge the numbers a little bit and say they did a great job at XYZ when either they didn't, or you don't know if they did, or whatever. So, but having those open conversations about that with the person that you're giving. I also, one more thing, I thought it was really interesting that she made the note about making sure you get more recommendations than you give, because that wasn't something that I thought about before in terms of making sure that that's like the ratio, which I thought was just really interesting, because, you know, you think, oh, I'm giving recommendations and that's really generous, and it's still showing that you are working with other people and giving those recommendations, but making sure that you get more than you give.
So
I thought
you
that
don't
was interesting.
Come across as spammy. Yeah.
I guess so.
Yeah.
It was just something that I didn't think about before, so it was interesting.
Interesting. Ben?
I liked the fact that you brought up the idea of writing the recommendation for yourself, or writing the recommendation and then passing it along to
I
the
did that.
person.
Yeah, making it,
I would
making
say
it easy for people.
75% of the people I've ever asked for a recommendation have basically said, yeah, you write it and I'll sign it, right? And you have to like be reasonable about what you're talking about, because, you know, that other person is going to cross things out if they don't believe them. But I think that's like a completely legitimate way things are really done. And if you can make life easier for your colleague or your peer, you should do it.
I think on that note, like I would at least like check in with the person first to be like, hey, is it okay if I write
Yeah.
like here's some of the things I would like you to talk about in the work experience that we've had together.
Yeah,
I
but
would be happy to write it. If you would prefer, just let me know, kind of
Right,
thing.
exactly. If
you
you're
want to be
too
like, hey, I
busy-
wrote this for you, please post it on my LinkedIn.
I
you know?
agree. I like that of like giving when you're doing the initial pitch of saying, giving some of the bullet points, like she said, of like, here are some of the things that we've talked about in person before that I think you could speak really highly to.
Yeah.
Let me know if you don't have the time for this, and I'd be happy to,
write it for you.
help a little bit more or whatever. And if they're like, if they come back to you and say, I would love to completely believe in all the things that you've done. I really am swamped right now. But then that is sort of a gateway to writing it and sending it back, saying, what do you sign off on this or whatever you want to say?
Because I think they do have to post it themselves. You can't
They
post
do.
it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Under their name.
Yeah.
And while we didn't talk about this, we just ran out of time. It's important to recognize it takes time to get 2 or 3 recommendations per position. So don't be frustrated if it takes you a number of months to line people up and get them
I was
published.
actually going to ask you that, Mac. What do you think is if you have? I know Viveka mentioned a little bit about this of you're new to LinkedIn or you haven't thought about recommendations before, and you want to go back to some of your previous jobs and ask for recommendations there. Does it? It'll show up as the current date rather than the time that you were working with the person or during the time frame that you worked at that job. Does that take away anything, or is it recommendations are good to have no matter when you get them?
They're good to have no matter when you get them. So I think 3 years ago, I went back and I got recommendations for at least 2 people for every job I had. And I'm dating myself, going back to 1980.
Wow.
And I found those people.
Yeah.
And it took about 3 months to go through that process with reminders. And but now they're in place. And I need to get better about as I get about adding a current 1 or 2 as I add new volunteer positions. But, yeah, but good stuff. And again, it's all about that social proof. So great points from all 3 of you, and thank you, Viveka, for those wonderful suggestions. And thank you, our listeners, for downloading today's episode of Find Your Dream Job. Now, if you like what you hear, please sign up for our free weekly newsletter. In every issue, we give you the key points of that week's show. And we include links to all the resources mentioned, as well as the transcript of the full episode. Subscribe to the newsletter now, and you'll get our new guide, The Top Career Podcasts of 2017. Discover all the podcasts that can help you find a great job and get the career you want. Get your free guide and newsletter today. Go to maxlist.org/topcareerpodcasts2017. And join us next Wednesday when our special guest will be Tony Restel. He'll share his secret for career happiness. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job.